The airplane cabin felt like it was closing in on him. Damon Washington adjusted his designer suit jacket and tried to focus on the business reports spread across his first-class tray table, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. 3 years. 3 long years since he'd walked out of that hospital room, leaving behind the woman who'd meant everything to him. The woman who'd lost their baby and seemed to blame him for not being there when it happened. He'd built an empire since then. Washington Tech Solutions had grown from a small startup to a multi-million-dollar company. Forbes had put him on their cover just last month. The youngest black tech millionaire in America, they'd called him. But none of that success could fill the hole in his chest where his heart used to be. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they were beginning their descent into Atlanta. Damon glanced at his watch. Just another business trip, just another deal to close. His assistant had booked him coach by mistake, and for once he hadn't bothered to change it. Maybe sitting with regular people would remind him what normal felt like. That's when he saw her, sitting 3 rows ahead, struggling with what looked like 2 toddlers who were having a complete meltdown. The woman's back was to him, but something about the way she moved, the gentle way she spoke to the children even as they cried, made his stomach drop. Her hair was different now, shorter, styled in neat locks that framed her face. But those shoulders, that graceful neck, the way she tilted her head when she was concentrating. "No, no, no," he whispered under his breath. One of the children, a little boy with skin the color of warm honey, turned around in his seat. Damon's breath caught completely. The child had his eyes, not just similar eyes, but his exact eyes. The same unusual golden brown color that his grandmother used to say was a gift from their African ancestors. Eyes that no one else in his family had except him. The little girl next to the boy turned too, and Damon felt like he might pass out right there in seat 23B. She had those same eyes, the same dimple in her left cheek that he saw every morning in the mirror. But more than that, she had his late mother's nose, the same small, perfect shape that people always said made his mom look like she could have been a movie star. The woman turned slightly, trying to calm the children, and Damon's worst fears were confirmed. Keisha, his Keisha, the woman he'd married 6 years ago in a small ceremony at her grandmother's church in Oakland. The woman who'd supported him through every late night, every failed pitch, every moment when he'd wanted to give up on his dreams. The woman whose heart he'd broken when he couldn't handle losing their first baby, and had blamed her for going to work that day instead of resting like the doctor said. But these children who looked exactly like him, they couldn't be more than 2 years old, which meant, "Mama, I want juice," the little boy said loudly enough for Damon to hear. Keisha's voice, softer now but still the same voice that used to sing him to sleep, responded, "I know, baby. Mama's going to get you juice in just a minute. Can you be patient for me?" Damon's mind raced. The math was simple and devastating. These children were born after their divorce, after he'd left her alone in that hospital bed, grieving and broken, after he'd moved across the country and thrown himself into work to forget the pain, after he'd convinced himself that she was better off without him. The little girl started crying again, and without thinking, Damon found himself leaning forward. He wanted to help, wanted to do something, anything. But what could he do? What right did he have? He'd given up that right when he'd chosen his pride over his marriage. "Excuse me," he heard himself saying to the flight attendant who was walking by. "Could you maybe help that mother with the children? They seem to be having a rough time." The flight attendant, a kind-looking older black woman with silver streaks in her hair, smiled at him. "That's sweet of you to notice, honey. Sometimes traveling with little ones can be overwhelming. Are you traveling with family?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. No, not anymore." But as he sat there, watching Keisha struggle alone with what might be his children, Damon realized that running away again wasn't an option. Not this time. These children, if they were his, deserved better than a father who disappeared when things got hard. And Keisha had been raising them alone while he'd been collecting magazine covers and business awards. The plane hit turbulence, and one of the children started crying louder. Without another thought, Damon unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. His legs felt like jelly, but he walked toward the front of the plane anyway. "Keisha," he said softly when he reached her row. She turned around, and the look of shock on her face was so complete that, for a moment, she didn't even seem to recognize him. Then her eyes went wide and all the color drained from her beautiful face. "Damon," she whispered. The children stopped crying and stared up at him with curious eyes. His eyes. Looking at them up close, there was no doubt. These were his children. The family he'd walked away from before he even knew it existed. "Can we talk?" he managed to say, his voice barely working. But before Keisha could answer, the little boy pointed at him and said, clear as day, "Daddy." The word hung in the air between them, like a bomb that had just gone off. Other passengers started to stare. The flight attendant approached with concern in her eyes, and Keisha looked like she might faint. "How did you?" Damon started to ask, but couldn't finish the question. "They've seen pictures," Keisha said quietly. I couldn't let them think their father didn't exist." The little girl reached up toward him, and instinctively Damon picked her up. She felt so small in his arms, so perfect. She had his mother's nose and his eyes, but her smile was all Keisha. "What are their names?" he asked. "David and Diana," Keisha said, tears starting to form in her eyes. "They're 2 years old." David and Diana. She'd given them names that started with D, like his name. Like she'd wanted them to carry a piece of him even though he wasn't there. The plane started its final descent, and the captain announced that everyone needed to return to their seats. But Damon couldn't move. He couldn't just go back to his seat and pretend this wasn't happening. "I have so many questions," he said. "I know," Keisha replied. "But right now, can you just help me with them? This is my first time flying alone with both of them, and they're scared." Damon nodded and gently buckled Diana into her seat while Keisha handled David. For the next 20 minutes, as the plane descended into Atlanta, they worked together to keep the twins calm. And for those 20 minutes, Damon felt more complete than he had in 3 years. But as the plane touched down and people started gathering their belongings, reality set in. What happened now? How do you rebuild a life that you destroyed? How do you become a father to children who don't really know you? How do you face the woman whose heart you broke? "Keisha," he said as they waited for their turn to get off the plane, "I need to know everything. About them, about you, about what happened after I left." She looked at him with eyes that held so much pain and strength it took his breath away. "It's been 3 years, Damon. 3 years of doing this alone. You can't just show up and expect." "I know," he said quickly. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But these are my children, aren't they?" She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "They are." "Then let me try to make this right. Please. Let me try to be the man they deserve, the man you deserved 3 years ago." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the plane, Damon realized that this chance encounter might be the answer to prayers he didn't even know he'd been praying. But he also knew that earning back Keisha's trust and becoming a real father to David and Diana would be the hardest thing he'd ever done. The question was he finally ready to stop running? The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of arriving passengers, but Damon felt like he was walking through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. He couldn't tell which. He'd helped Keisha carry the twins' bags, and now they sat in a quiet corner of the terminal, David and Diana, playing with some toys their mother had packed, while the adults tried to figure out how to have the most important conversation of their lives. "They need to eat," Keisha said, avoiding his eyes as she pulled out small containers of crackers and juice boxes. "Their routine is everything to them. Structure helps them feel safe." Damon watched as she efficiently set up a little picnic on the terminal seats. Everything about her movements was different now, more confident, more sure of herself. Motherhood had changed her in ways that made her even more beautiful than he remembered. "How long have you been in California?" he asked, trying to make conversation while the twins ate. "We live in Oakland now. I moved back in with Grandma Rose after." She paused, glancing at the children. "After everything happened." Grandma Rose. Damon remembered her well. A tiny woman with a voice that could command a church full of people and a heart big enough to adopt half the neighborhood. She'd never liked him much, thought he was too focused on money and success to take proper care of her granddaughter. "How is she?" "She passed away last year," Keisha said quietly. "Heart attack." She was 83. The news hit him harder than expected. Grandma Rose had been the one to marry them, had been the one to tell him he'd better treat Keisha right or answer to her. She'd also been the one to call him every name in the book when he'd left. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have been there for the funeral for you." "You made your choice," Keisha replied, but there wasn't anger in her voice anymore. "Just sadness. I called you, when she died, your number was disconnected." Damon closed his eyes. He'd changed his number twice in the past 3 years, trying to start fresh each time, trying to forget. "Daddy sad?" Diana asked, looking up at him with those golden eyes. The word daddy still made his chest tight. "No, baby girl, daddy's okay." David crawled over and patted Damon's knee with his sticky little hand. "Daddy come home." Keisha's intake of breath was sharp. "David, sweetie, remember what Mama told you. Sometimes grown-ups have to live in different places." But David wasn't satisfied with that answer. "Why Daddy live different place?" Damon looked at Keisha, silently asking permission to answer. She nodded slightly. "Sometimes," Damon said carefully, "grown-ups make mistakes, big mistakes. And they have to figure out how to fix them." "You fix mistake?" Diana asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. "I'm trying to, sweetheart." After the twins finished eating, Keisha suggested they walk around the terminal. The children needed to burn off energy, and she clearly needed space to think. They ended up at a quiet gate where a delayed flight meant most of the seats were empty. "I need to know," Damon said once the twins were distracted by the planes outside the window. "What happened after I left? How did you find out you were pregnant?" Keisha was quiet for a long moment, watching David and Diana point excitedly at a plane taxiing on the runway. "I found out 2 weeks after you moved to Seattle," she said finally. "I kept meaning to call you, but every time I picked up the phone, I remembered what you said when you left." Damon's stomach dropped. He remembered exactly what he'd said. Cruel words born from grief and guilt. Words about how maybe they weren't meant to be parents, how maybe losing the baby was a sign that they should stop trying. "I was grieving," he said weakly. "I didn't mean." "But you did mean it," Keisha interrupted. "At least, that's how it felt. So when I found out I was pregnant with twins, I thought maybe you'd see it as another mistake waiting to happen." The weight of his failures pressed down on him like a mountain. She'd been pregnant and scared, and instead of having a husband to support her, she'd had the memory of his cruel words echoing in her head. "I wanted to tell you," she continued, "especially when the pregnancy got complicated. I was on bed rest for the last 3 months. Grandma Rose had to quit her part-time job at the church to take care of me. We almost lost them twice." Damon felt sick. While he'd been building his company and telling himself he was better off alone, Keisha had been fighting to bring their children safely into the world. "But you didn't tell me." "What would have been the point?" she asked, and for the first time there was a flash of the old fire in her eyes. "You'd already made it clear that you didn't want a family with me. I wasn't going to beg you to come back just because I was pregnant." "So you did it all alone?" "Not alone. I had Grandma Rose, and my cousin Jasmine flew in from Detroit to help when the babies were born. The ladies from the church brought meals for weeks. Mrs. Patterson from down the street watched them sometimes so I could work. She'd built a village to help raise his children, while he'd been collecting business awards, and thinking he was so successful. "What kind of work?" he asked. "I went back to school, got my nursing degree. I work at Oakland Children's Hospital now in the NICU." She paused, "helping other families with premature babies." Of course she did. Keisha had always been the one to turn pain into purpose, to find ways to help others heal from the same wounds she'd suffered. "Are you happy?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm content. My children are healthy and loved. I have a job that matters. We have a little house near where I grew up, and the twins know their neighbors and their community. It's a good life. But are you happy?" "Happiness is a luxury I don't really think about anymore," she said. "I think about making sure David and Diana feel secure and loved. I think about being the best mother I can be. I think about building the kind of life they deserve." Her words cut deeper than any anger could have. She'd reorganized her entire existence around being a single mother, and she'd done it with grace and strength that made him feel small in comparison. "Mama, I need bathroom," David announced, tugging on Keisha's sleeve. "Me too," Diana chimed in. "Okay, babies, let's go." Keisha started to gather their things, but Damon stood up too. "I'll help," he said. She looked surprised but nodded. Together, they managed the complicated logistics of taking two toddlers to the bathroom, and Damon found himself amazed by how naturally the routine came to him. Diana held his hand and chattered about the airplanes while David told him a long, complicated story about a dog he'd seen at the park. When they got back to their seats, Keisha's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "I have to take this," she said. "It's about our connecting flight." While she talked, Damon found himself alone with his children for the first time. David climbed into the seat next to him and leaned against his arm. "Daddy, you smell different," he said matter-of-factly. "Different how?" Like the place where Mama works, clean." Diana giggled. "Mama says the hospital smells like clean." "You visit Mama at work?" "Sometimes," Diana said. "When Mrs. Johnson can't watch us, Mama shows us the babies." "Do you like the babies?" "They're tiny," David said, spreading his arms to show just how tiny. "Tinier than us when we were babies." "Mama says we were tiny too," Diana added, "but we got big and strong." Looking at them now, chattering away like they'd known him their whole lives, Damon realized that Keisha had done something extraordinary. She'd raised children who were confident and happy and secure, despite the fact that their father had never been there. She'd somehow managed to keep them from feeling abandoned or unwanted. "Do you ever wonder about your daddy?" he asked gently. David nodded seriously. "Mama says you had to go away for work, like when she goes to work but longer." "She says you love us even though you can't be here," Diana said. "She shows us your picture and says we have your eyes." Damon's throat tightened. Even after everything he'd put her through, Keisha had protected their children from feeling rejected. She'd found a way to make his absence feel like circumstance rather than choice. Keisha returned, her expression tense. "Our connecting flight is delayed by 3 hours," she said. "There's weather in Oakland." "Where are you staying tonight?" Damon asked. "We're not. The flight gets in at midnight and then we take BART home. It's cheaper than a hotel." The thought of Keisha managing two tired toddlers on public transportation at midnight made Damon's chest tighten. "Let me get you a hotel room, please." "I don't need your money, Damon." "It's not about need. It's about, let me do this one thing. Let me take care of you tonight, even if it's just making sure you have a place to rest." She studied his face for a long moment. "Why are you really here? In Atlanta, I mean. What's the coincidence that we ended up on the same flight? I'm here for a business meeting, trying to acquire a smaller tech company. He paused, but maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe this is the universe giving me a chance to fix the biggest mistake I ever made. Before Keisha could respond, David tugged on Damon's sleeve. Daddy, are you coming home with us? The question hung in the air between all of them. Diana looked up at him with hopeful eyes, and Damon realized that whatever happened next would shape the rest of all their lives. I don't know yet, buddy, he said honestly. But I'm going to try. The hotel room Damon had booked for them was nothing fancy, just a standard two-bed suite at the airport Marriott, but to Keisha, it felt like luxury. The twins were fascinated by the big bathtub and the little bottles of shampoo, and for the first time all day, they seemed to relax. Damon had gotten his own room down the hall, but he'd stayed to help with dinner and bedtime. Now, as David and Diana splashed in the bathtub, Keisha found herself watching him from the doorway. He was sitting on the bathroom floor, sleeves rolled up, completely unbothered by the water they were splashing on his expensive suit. Daddy, look, Diana held up a handful of bubbles. I made ice cream. That's the best bubble ice cream I've ever seen, Damon said seriously, and Diana giggled with delight. Can you make a bubble hat? David asked. Without hesitation, Damon scooped up some bubbles and gently placed them on David's head. How's that, little man? I'm a bubble king, David announced, and Diana clapped her hands. Watching them together, Keisha felt something crack open in her chest. This was what she'd imagined when she'd first found out she was pregnant. This easy joy, this simple family moment. She'd grieved the loss of it so many times over the past 2 years, but seeing it now made the grief fresh again. Okay, bubble kings and queens, she said, stepping into the bathroom. Time to get out before you turn into raisins. The bedtime routine that followed was surprisingly smooth. Damon seemed to instinctively know how to help without getting in the way. He read David a story while Keisha got Diana into her pajamas, then switched so Diana could hear a story too. By the time both twins were tucked into one of the hotel beds, it was nearly 9 o'clock. They're beautiful, Damon said quietly as they stood in the doorway, watching the children sleep. They look like you, Keisha replied. Everyone says so. Sometimes it's hard seeing you in their faces every day. They moved to the small sitting area near the window. Atlanta sprawled out below them, twinkling with lights. Keisha curled up in one of the chairs while Damon sat on the couch, and for a moment they just sat in comfortable silence. Can I ask you something? Keisha said finally. Anything. What happened to you after you left? I mean, I know about the business success, but what happened to you as a person? Damon was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights. I threw myself into work, he said finally. 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I told myself I was building something important, but really I was just trying not to think about what I'd lost. Did it work? For a while. The first year was the hardest. I kept reaching for my phone to call you, kept turning over in bed expecting you to be there. But after the business started taking off, it got easier to pretend I was fine. And now, he looked at her directly. Now I realize I haven't been living. I've been existing, going through the motions of a successful life but feeling empty inside. Keisha nodded. She understood that feeling better than she cared to admit. What about you? He asked. Those first months after I left, how did you manage? Barely, she said honestly. I was so angry at you, but I was also terrified. When I found out I was pregnant, I spent the first week crying. Then Grandma Rose sat me down and told me I could cry or I could figure out how to take care of my babies. But I couldn't do both. That sounds like her. She was right, though. I had to make a choice about what kind of mother I wanted to be. Did I want to be bitter and resentful, Or did I want to focus on giving David and Diana the best life possible? You chose them. Every day. Even on the hardest days, when David was colicky and Diana wouldn't sleep, and I hadn't showered in 3 days and was living on crackers and coffee, I chose them. Damon leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I should have been there for that, for all of it. Yes, you should have, but you weren't, and I survived it. We survived it. Are you ever going to forgive me? The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on protecting herself and the twins that she hadn't really thought about forgiveness. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm not sure I even know how to forgive something like that. You didn't just leave me, Damon. You left the possibility of us. You made me feel like loving you was a mistake. It wasn't. Loving you was the best thing I ever did. Leaving you was the worst. Then why did you do it? He was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I was scared. Because when we lost the baby, I felt like such a failure as a husband, as a man. I couldn't protect you from that pain, couldn't fix it, couldn't make it better. And I thought if I could just focus on work, on building something successful, then maybe I could prove I wasn't a complete failure. So you proved it by abandoning your wife. I know how it sounds, I know how wrong it was. But at the time, it felt like the only thing I could control. I couldn't control whether you got pregnant again, couldn't control whether something would go wrong, couldn't control your grief or mine. But I could control my business. Keisha studied his face. She could see the genuine remorse there, but she could also see the same fear that had driven him away 3 years ago. What makes you think you've changed? She asked. What makes you think you won't run again when things get hard? Because I spent 3 years learning what life feels like without you and the family we could have had. Because I realized that all the success in the world doesn't mean anything if you have no one to share it with. Because I met my children today, and I can't imagine walking away from them. It's not just about wanting to be here for the good times, Damon. Parenting is hard. It's exhausting and frustrating and sometimes thankless. David had night terrors for 6 months. Diana went through a phase where she bit other kids at daycare. There are days when they both have meltdowns at the grocery store, and I have to carry them out while everyone stares. I want to be there for that too. All of it. Even when I'm the one having the meltdown. Even when I'm tired and cranky and haven't had time to wash my hair in 3 days. Especially then. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But she'd built her life around the assumption that she was doing this alone, and the thought of letting him back in, of risking that kind of hurt again, terrified her. I need time, she said finally. This is all too much too fast. I need to think about what's best for David and Diana. I understand, but Keisha, I'm not going anywhere this time. Whatever you decide, however long it takes, I'm not disappearing again. How can I trust that? Let me show you. Let me prove it. Before she could respond, David's voice called out from the bedroom. Mama, I had a bad dream. They both got up, but David reached for Damon instead of Keisha. Daddy, there was a monster. Hey, buddy, it's okay, Damon said, scooping him up. Dreams can't hurt you, you're safe. Will you stay until I go back to sleep? Damon looked at Keisha questioningly. She nodded. Of course I will, he said. As they settled David back into bed, Diana stirred and reached for Keisha. Soon, all four of them were crowded together on the hotel bed, the twins in the middle, slowly drifting back to sleep. Mama, Diana whispered just before she fell asleep, is Daddy going to be here when we wake up? Keisha looked across the children at Damon. His eyes were full of hope and determination, but she could also see her own fear reflected there. We'll see, baby girl, she whispered back. We'll see. But as she lay there in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of her children and the man who'd given them life, Keisha realized that part of her hoped the answer would be yes. Despite everything, despite the hurt and the fear and the 3 years of learning to live without him, part of her still wanted them to be a family. The question was whether she was brave enough to risk everything on that possibility. Morning came too early and too bright. Keisha woke up to find Diana draped across her chest and David curled up against Damon's side like it was the most natural thing in the world. For a moment before full consciousness kicked in, it felt like the family mornings she'd once dreamed of. Then reality crashed back, and she carefully extracted herself from the tangle of limbs. Damon was already awake, she realized. He was lying still so as not to disturb David, but his eyes were open, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Good morning," he whispered. "Morning," she whispered back, then padded to the bathroom to splash cold water on her face and try to make sense of her thoughts. When she came out, Damon was sitting up, David still asleep against his shoulder. "I ordered room service," he said quietly. "Pancakes and eggs. I remembered the twins like pancakes." "How do you remember that?" she asked, surprised. "You told me, years ago, when we were planning what we'd feed our kids for breakfast someday." The memory hit her like a wave. They'd been lying in bed on a Sunday morning, talking about their future children, making silly plans about birthday parties and bedtime stories and, yes, weekend pancakes. She'd forgotten that conversation, had buried it along with all the other dreams that had died when he left. The twins woke up gradually, Diana first, then David. They were delighted to find both parents there, and even more delighted when room service arrived with a cart full of food. For 30 minutes, it was almost like they were a normal family on vacation. The twins chattered about the airplanes they could see from the window, and Damon helped David cut his pancakes while Keisha made sure Diana didn't put too much syrup on hers. But underneath the pleasant normalcy, Keisha's mind was racing. Their flight to Oakland left in 3 hours. After that, what happened? Did Damon go back to Seattle and his business empire? Did they exchange phone numbers and figure out some kind of visitation schedule? Did they try to build something together, or was this just a brief detour in the separate lives they'd been living? "Daddy, are you coming on the airplane with us?" Diana asked, as if reading her mother's thoughts. Damon looked at Keisha. "I'd like to if that's okay with Mama." "But what about your business meeting?" Keisha asked. "I can reschedule it. Or handle it by video call. The business will survive without me for a few days." 3 years ago, Damon wouldn't have considered rescheduling an important meeting for anything. The fact that he was willing to do it now should have been reassuring, but it also made Keisha nervous. Grand gestures were easy. It was the day-to-day commitment that was hard, the unglamorous work of showing up even when it wasn't convenient or exciting. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "I want to come to Oakland. I want to see where you live, meet the people who have been helping you raise our children. I want to understand the life you've built." "And then what?" "And then we figure out what comes next. Together." David had been listening to this conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult discussions they sense are important. "Daddy, do you live in a big house?" "I have an apartment in Seattle." "It's pretty big, I guess." "Bigger than our house." "I don't know, buddy. I haven't seen your house yet." "It's not very big," Diana said matter-of-factly, "but it has a garden where Mama grows tomatoes." "And my room has glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling," David added. "Mama put them there." "That sounds perfect," Damon said, and Keisha could hear the sincerity in his voice. After breakfast, while the twins played with the hotel's complimentary coloring books, Keisha called her cousin Jasmine. "Girl, you are not going to believe this," she said when Jasmine picked up. "Try me. After 2 years of single motherhood, I'm pretty sure nothing could surprise me anymore." "I ran into Damon." On the plane yesterday. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Keisha wondered if the call had dropped. Jasmine, you there? I'm here, I'm just processing. Run into how? Like you saw him from a distance, or like he was sitting 3 rows behind me and the twins, and David turned around and called him Daddy. Oh honey, oh no, how are you feeling? Are you okay? Do I need to fly to Atlanta and beat him up? Despite everything, Keisha found herself smiling. I'm confused, scared, a little hopeful, which is the scariest part. What does he want? He says he wants to be part of their lives. Part of our lives, maybe. He wants to come to Oakland. And what do you want? It was the question Keisha had been avoiding asking herself. I want what's best for David and Diana. That's not what I asked. What do you want? Keisha looked across the room at Damon, who was now sitting on the floor with the twins, helping them color a picture of an airplane. David was explaining the difference between different types of planes with the authoritative confidence of a 2-year-old, and Damon was listening like it was the most fascinating lecture he'd ever heard. I want to believe that people can change, she said quietly. I want to believe that this time could be different. But I'm terrified of getting hurt again, and I'm even more terrified of David and Diana getting hurt. They're so happy to have him here, Jazz. What happens when he decides this is too hard and leaves again? You won't know unless you give him a chance to prove himself. Or I could protect all of us by keeping things the way they are. Honey, you know I love you, and I supported you when you decided not to tell him about the pregnancy. But those babies have a right to know their father, and you have a right to happiness too. What if he breaks their hearts? What if he doesn't? What if this is your second chance at the family you always wanted? After she hung up, Keisha sat quietly for a moment, watching Damon with the twins. He was so natural with them, so patient. When Diana accidentally broke her crayon, he didn't get frustrated. He just helped her tape it back together and showed her how the break made an interesting texture in her coloring. When David spilled juice on his shirt, Damon cleaned it up without making a big deal about it. Okay, she said finally, you can come to Oakland. Damon looked up from the coloring book, hope spreading across his face. Really? For a week, just to see how it goes, but I have conditions. Name them. You stay in a hotel, not with us. The twins don't need the confusion of thinking we're suddenly a family again until we figure out what this is. Agreed. You don't make promises you can't keep. If you're going to be in their lives, you have to be reliable. No showing up when it's convenient and disappearing when it's not. I understand. And if this doesn't work out, if you decide you can't handle it, you tell me honestly instead of just disappearing. They deserve better than that. It will work out, Damon said firmly. I won't let them down again. I won't let you down again. Keisha wanted to believe him. Looking at him sitting there with their children, she almost did. The flight to Oakland was easier than the one from Los Angeles had been. The twins were more comfortable with Damon now, and having 2 adults to manage them made everything smoother. Diana fell asleep in Damon's arms halfway through the flight, and David entertained himself by teaching Damon a clapping game he'd learned at daycare. As they descended towards San Francisco Bay, Keisha found herself seeing her city through Damon's eyes. The sprawling urban landscape, the hills and bridges, the mix of gleaming tech buildings and older neighborhoods where families like hers made their homes. It's beautiful, Damon said, looking out the window. It's home, Keisha replied simply. The BART train from the airport to Oakland was crowded with evening commuters, but the twins were used to public transportation. They sat quietly, David on Keisha's lap and Diana on Damon's, watching the familiar scenery pass by outside the windows. This is our stop, Keisha announced as they pulled into MacArthur Station. Their neighborhood was a mix of small houses and apartment buildings, tree-lined streets where kids played on sidewalks and neighbors knew each other's names. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe and friendly, the kind of place where children could grow up feeling like they belonged. "That's Mrs. Johnson's house," Diana pointed out as they walked down Acacia Street. "She makes cookies." "And that's where Marcus lives," David added. "He has a dog named Buddy." "Sounds like you know everyone," Damon said. "It's a good neighborhood for kids," Acacia said. "People look out for each other." Her house was small, a two-bedroom cottage with a front porch and a tiny yard. Someone had clearly been taking care of it while she was away. The grass was watered and the mail was collected. "Mrs. Patterson," Acacia explained, seeing Damon's questioning look. "She has a key for emergencies." Inside, the house was exactly what Damon had expected, and nothing like his sterile Seattle apartment. The living room was small but cozy, with a sectional couch covered in colorful throws and children's books scattered on every surface. The walls were covered with photos, David and Diana at various ages, Acacia with her nursing school classmates, pictures of Grandma Rose and other family members. "This is where we live," Diana announced, spinning in the middle of the living room like she was showing off a palace. "Can I see your room with the glow-in-the-dark stars?" Damon asked David. The tour that followed was brief but revealing. The twins shared a bedroom that was small but efficiently organized, with twin beds and a play area near the window. David's stars were indeed glued to the ceiling in the pattern of actual constellations, and Diana had a collection of stuffed animals arranged carefully on her bed. Acacia's room was barely big enough for a double bed and a dresser, but it was neat and comfortable. The whole house felt lived in and loved, the kind of place where children felt safe and families made memories. "I should get them dinner and put them to bed," Acacia said as they finished the tour. "They're past their usual schedule." "Can I help?" She hesitated, then nodded. "You can set the table while I make mac and cheese." The domestic routine that followed felt both foreign and familiar. Damon found plates and cups in the kitchen cabinets, while Acacia boiled pasta and heated up leftover vegetables from the refrigerator. The twins helped by putting napkins at each place setting and arguing about who got to sit where. "Daddy sits next to me," Diana declared. "No, next to me," David countered. "How about Daddy sits between both of you?" Acacia suggested, and the twins accepted this compromise. Dinner was chaotic in the way that meals with toddlers always are. David spilled milk, Diana dropped cheese on the floor, and both children talked constantly, telling Damon about their friends and their toys and their daily routines. But it was also warm and real in a way that Damon's quiet, solitary dinners in Seattle had never been. After dinner came baths and pajamas, and the elaborate bedtime routine that Acacia had perfected over 2 years of single parenthood. Stories and songs and drinks of water and one more hug and one more kiss, and promises that Mama would check on them in 5 minutes. "Will Daddy be here tomorrow?" David asked as Acacia tucked him in. "Daddy's going to stay in Oakland for a few days," she said carefully. "We'll see him tomorrow." "Good," Diana said sleepily. "I like having a daddy." When the children were finally asleep, Acacia and Damon sat on the front porch with cups of tea. The evening was warm, and the sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night created a peaceful background. Dogs barking in the distance, a television murmuring through an open window, children playing in a nearby yard. "Thank you," Damon said quietly. "For what?" "For letting me see this, for letting me understand what their life is like. It's beautiful, Acacia, what you've built here, the home you've made for them. It's everything I was too scared to try for." It wasn't easy. There were times, especially in the beginning, when I didn't think I could do it. But you did. With a lot of help, this neighborhood, these people. They became our family when we needed one. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the street slowly quiet down as evening turned to night. "What happens now?" Damon asked finally. Now you prove that this isn't just a nice idea you had on an airplane, Keisha said. Now you show up, day after day, even when it's boring or difficult or inconvenient. And if I do that, if I prove that I've changed? Keisha looked at him, this man who'd broken her heart and given her the two most precious things in her life. Then maybe we figure out how to be a family. I want that more than anything. So did I once. But wanting isn't enough, Damon. You have to choose it every single day, even when it's hard. I know, and I will. As they said goodnight and Damon left for his hotel, Keisha stood in her doorway watching him walk away. 3 years ago, watching him leave had been the most painful moment of her life. Tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt like he was leaving but coming back. Whether that feeling would survive the reality of daily life remained to be seen. 3 weeks later, Keisha stood in her kitchen making breakfast while David and Diana sat at the table, chattering about their plans for the day. It was Saturday morning, which meant Daddy Day. The routine they'd fallen into where Damon spent the entire day with them while Keisha caught up on errands or, occasionally, took a few hours for herself. Daddy's taking us to the zoo today, Diana announced to her stuffed elephant, who was apparently joining them for breakfast. And we're going to see the lions, David added, making a roaring sound that made Diana giggle. Through the kitchen window, Keisha could see Damon's rental car pulling up outside. He'd been true to his word about staying in Oakland, extending his trip week by week, handling his business remotely, and showing up every single day. He'd attended Diana's doctor's appointment when she had an ear infection. He'd picked David up from daycare when Keisha had to work late. He'd even learned to braid Diana's hair, though his attempts were still a little lopsided. More importantly, he'd done the small, unglamorous things that real parenting required. He'd cleaned up vomit when both twins had stomach flu. He'd dealt with David's tantrum in the grocery store with patience and calm. He'd read Goodnight Moon 17 times in one evening because Diana was going through a phase where she needed everything to be exactly the same. "Daddy's here," David shouted, scrambling down from his chair to run to the front door. Keisha followed more slowly, finding Damon on the porch with David in his arms and Diana wrapped around his leg. "Good morning," he said, and she noticed he looked tired. "Rough night." "Conference call with Tokyo at 3 a.m. But I'm good to go." He set David down and ruffled Diana's hair. "Are you ready for the zoo, little lady?" "I'm ready. Can we see the penguins?" "We can see whatever you want to see." As Keisha helped the twins gather their things, snacks and juice boxes, and the small backpack Diana insisted on carrying everywhere, she found herself watching Damon carefully. Over the past 3 weeks, she'd been looking for cracks in his facade, waiting for signs that he was getting tired of the routine or frustrated with the demands of parenting. But if anything, he seemed to be getting more comfortable, more natural with the children. "I'll have them back by dinner time," he said as they prepared to leave. "Actually," Keisha said, making a decision she'd been considering all week, "why don't you bring them back after dinner? We could eat together." Something shifted in Damon's expression. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." The day passed quietly for Keisha. She did laundry and grocery shopping, caught up on some work emails, and had lunch with her friend Maria from the hospital. But mostly, she found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with Jasmine the night before. "So how's it going with Prince Charming?" Jasmine had asked. "He's not Prince Charming, he's just trying really hard." "And how do you feel about that?" Confused, hopeful, terrified. "The usual then." "Jazz, what if I'm making a mistake? What if I let him back into our lives and he hurts the kids? What if you don't let him back in, and you miss out on the family you've always wanted? I built a good life without him." "We're happy." "You're content, there's a difference." That conversation had been echoing in Keisha's head all day. Was she content or was she happy? And what was the difference, really? By the time Damon returned with the twins at 6 o'clock, Keisha had dinner ready, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs with garlic bread. But she'd set the table with the good dishes and lit a candle, making an effort she hadn't made in months. "Mama, we saw elephants," Diana announced, running into the kitchen covered in zoo dirt and excitement. "And monkeys," David added. "They were swinging on ropes." "Sounds like you had quite an adventure," Keisha said, helping them wash their hands. "Why don't you tell me all about it over dinner?" The meal that followed was loud and chaotic, with both twins talking over each other to describe every animal they'd seen. Damon added details and asked questions, and Keisha found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. This felt like a family dinner, not the carefully orchestrated routine she'd created for herself and the twins, but the kind of warm, messy, joyful meal she'd imagined when she was pregnant. After dinner, they all cleaned up together, then settled in the living room for the twins' evening routine. Damon read David a story while Keisha helped Diana pick out clothes for the next day. Then they switched, and by the time both children were in bed, it was almost 9 o'clock. "They're exhausted," Keisha said as they settled on the couch with glasses of wine. "Thank you for wearing them out." "Thank you for letting me." And for dinner it felt like a family. Yeah, like a family. They sat quietly for a moment, and Keisha realized this was the first time in 3 weeks that they'd been alone together for more than a few minutes. She'd been careful to maintain boundaries, to keep their interactions focused on the children. But now, in the soft light of her living room with the sounds of her sleeping children in the background, those boundaries felt less important. "I need to tell you something," Damon said suddenly. Keisha's stomach tightened. Here it was. The moment when he told her this was too hard, too complicated, too much responsibility. "I put my Seattle apartment on the market this week." "What?" "I've been thinking about it for days, and I finally called my realtor. I want to move here, to Oakland. I want to be close to them, to you." "Damon, you can't just uproot your whole life because..." "Because why? Because I want to be a real father to my children. Because I want to be part of their daily lives instead of just visiting them on weekends." "What about your business?" "I can run it from anywhere. Most of our clients are in Silicon Valley anyway. It actually makes more business sense to be here than in Seattle." Keisha set down her wine glass, needing a moment to process. "This is a big decision. You've only been here 3 weeks. I've had 3 years to think about what I want my life to look like. These 3 weeks just showed me what's possible. And what if it doesn't work out? What if we try this and it falls apart? Then at least we'll know we tried. But Keisha, I don't think it's going to fall apart. I think we're building something real here." She looked around her living room, at the family photos on the walls and the children's toys scattered on the floor, and the candles still flickering on the dining room table. 3 weeks ago, this had been her sanctuary, the safe space she'd created for herself and her children. Now it felt like something else. It felt like home for all of them. "Where would you live?" she asked. "I found a rental house about 10 minutes from here. Close enough to help with carpool and bedtime routines, far enough to give you space." "You've really thought this through." "I've thought about nothing else for 3 weeks." Keisha stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where she'd built her life. Mrs. Patterson's porch light was on across the street. The Johnsons' cat was prowling through her garden. Everything looked the same as it had that morning, but something fundamental had shifted. "I'm scared," she said without turning around. "So am I. What if we mess this up? What if we hurt each other again? What if we don't? What if this time we get it right?" She turned to face him. He was still sitting on her couch, but his whole posture was different now. Open, hopeful, vulnerable in a way she remembered from their early days together. The twins would be so happy, she said quietly. What about you? Would you be happy? It was the question she'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. The question Jasmine had been pushing her to answer. The question that would determine the course of all their lives. I think I could be, she said finally. I think I want to try. Damon stood up and crossed the room to her, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without feeling crowded. I love you, he said simply. I never stopped loving you. I was just too scared and too proud to admit that I needed you more than I needed to be right. I love you too, she whispered, but love wasn't enough before. How do we make sure it's enough this time? We do the work. We talk to each other instead of making assumptions. We fight for this instead of running away when it gets hard. We put David and Diana first always. Always. And we take it slow. No rushing into anything just because it feels good in the moment. As slow as you need. Keisha looked into his eyes, those golden brown eyes that their children had inherited, and saw something she'd been afraid to hope for. She saw commitment, she saw understanding, she saw a man who'd learned from his mistakes and was ready to do better. Okay, she said, let's try. When he kissed her, soft and careful and full of promise, Keisha felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt complete. 6 months later, Keisha stood in the same spot by her living room window, but everything had changed. The house was fuller now, with Damon's books mixed in with hers on the shelves and his coffee mug in the sink next to her teacup. David and Diana had adjusted to having their father around with the easy acceptance of children who'd always known they were loved. The transition hadn't been perfect. There had been arguments about discipline styles and bedtime routines. There had been moments when old fears surfaced and old wounds ached. But there had also been birthday parties and soccer games and quiet Sunday mornings when all 4 of them piled into the big bed to read stories and plan their day. Mama, Daddy's making pancakes, Diana announced, running into the living room in her pajamas. He's making them in funny shapes, David added. Mine looks like a dinosaur. That sounds amazing, Keisha said. Go wash your hands and I'll be right there. As the twins scampered off to the bathroom, Keisha took one more moment to look out at her street. Mrs. Patterson was watering her flowers. The Johnsons' dog was barking at a squirrel. Children were riding bikes on the sidewalk while their parents watched from front porches. It looked exactly the same as it had 6 months ago, but for Keisha, everything was different. She was different. She was no longer just surviving, just making the best of a difficult situation. She was thriving. She was happy. Hey, Damon said, appearing in the doorway with flour in his hair and a smile on his face. Breakfast is ready. And I made enough for Mrs. Patterson if she wants to join us. She'd love that, Keisha said, taking his offered hand. She's been dying to hear more about your business. And I've been dying to hear more stories about you as a little girl. As they walked toward the kitchen, where their children were arguing about whose pancake looked more like an animal, Keisha realized that this was what she'd been waiting for all along. Not the perfect life, not the fairy tale ending, but this messy, complicated, beautiful reality of a family that had found its way back to each other. They'd lost each other once, but they'd found their way home. And this time, they were here to stay.